resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not only those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia. This is Barbara Humphrey, and I have with me today
Albert Strickland
and Phoenix Godwin.
Today's program is going to be a bit unusual because the format, well, there's really not a format.
And we kind of changed things around for this one because of the subject matter, which you will understand shortly, we hope.
We hope. We have a question to start with. We've called the show to change everything. And the question is, if you could change everything, what would you change? Would you go on vacation for the rest of your life? Make fossil fuels stop causing climate change? Ask for ethical banks and politicians? This first question is from a little booklet called The Anarchist Appeal. Here's some things on our list. We have selected some things that we think kill people, kill the planet, and oppress people. In our category of killing people, we have militarism and endless war, unaffordable health care, militarized police, nationalism, the dark state, and political corruption, hunger, poisoned food, the war on drugs. And I'm sure that list could go on and on. In terms of killing the planet, we've got pipelines, fossil fuel extraction and use, nuclear power, mineral extraction, fracking, deforestation, pesticides, industrial agriculture. And under the things that oppress people, and you may notice as I'm reading this list that some things come out in more than one place, because certainly there are things that oppress people and also kill them. We have poverty, the criminal injustice system and mass incarceration, public education, below living wage jobs, racism, homophobia, gender bias, hunger, mass media, war on drugs, economic exploitation, mass surveillance, just to name a few. And again from the Anarchist Appeal, surely nothing could be more unrealistic than to keep everything the way it is and expect different results. Our private financial and emotional struggles mirror global upheaval and disaster. And as we're looking at all of these things that kill the planet, kill people, oppress people, I'm reminded of the words of Cornel West, connect the dots. They are all related. We could spend the rest of our days trying to douse these fires one by one, but they all stem from the same source. And now I'm going to direct this to Phoenix and Albert. Tell us what the root of these problems, the root of these things that we've identified needing change.
Well, historically, a lot of these issues can be traced back pretty much to the dawn of civilization. Some of the things which separated the new forms of living which were created then were particularly a type of totalitarian agriculture, as well as a institutionalized hierarchy. We developed a system where the food was placed under lock and key, and people were made to work for it in order to get it from a source that was hoarded by a class, essentially, that was above them. This is the earliest form of what we might call capitalism, which is defined as the when the means of production are privately owned and operated for the pursuit of profit. And even before that was a word that we applied to it, it was a system which we started to use with our farming and with our social infrastructure in order to maintain civilization as we've seen over the last 10,000 years.
Also, the root today, we would simply say, is capitalism, period. That's it, in today's world. And it has a lot of forms, not all, any of them good, really. The thing is that with capitalism is that it depends on that. That's why it's called capitalism. It depends on capital. And capital can only be extracted at the expense of the people. So people have no, I don't know what to say. We do have a responsibility to exert our power, but we often give in to the authority that they exert over us, which they really don't have. They only have it because we allow them to have it. We give it to them without question, which is something we've got to change from an anarchist point of view. The people is a prime source. Everything is from the bottom up, nothing from the top down. And the way the system is now, it's turned on its head because it is from the top down totally.
Okay, and if we were to look at making change, if we ask the question, which we ask quite often, what is there to be done? How can we make change? And clearly we can fix these things. We can try to reform them. Certainly from a personal perspective, we can be the change we want to see in the world, or we can tear it all down and build it back up. So those are really three options we have. I have a quote from Frederick Douglass that I would like to read to you. And basically, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress.
And I think that's the key phrase. We endure this oppression when we should be overruling or throwing this oppression off. So we have to realize what's happening to us, and we're kind of wandering through space, it seems like, in this current age and time, not knowing where to turn, because we can see the problems, and we're overwhelmed with what is to be done, because we really, most of us, because of the system and the way it's imposed upon us, have no idea.
Right. And as to why we need to change, we have to ask ourselves, what is the alternative? What happens to us if nothing changes? And when do we need to change? Most of us believe we need to change now, that we're clearly running out of time. And it's going to take all of us, and the change needs to happen everywhere.
I think that, of course, nothing is going to change until we make that demand that you quoted. If we don't make the demand, it'll keep going just the way it is. And reform is not a solution at all of any kind. You cannot reform the system we have. It's unreformable, and we have to come to that conclusion right away. There's nothing we can do to reform it. We have to come up with a new system, implement that system, and change everything. Otherwise, we're just trying to correct a volume without trying to get to the solution.
I think when it comes to anarchy, also, it's also worth noting. It's very important to understand that there's not any one solution, actually, though. Mm-hmm. It comes down to changing our way of thinking and our cultural narrative. And when we start to dispel the myth that we're genetically predisposed to living within an hierarchical structure, which is not true if you ask any anthropologist, then we can actually start to create a new way for ourselves that really would be different. I mean, just like if you look at cultural anthropology, when societies and cultures were allowed to develop themselves in diverse ways, they did. and there was lots of different ways that people were able to find to live that worked and that weren't harmful to each other and that weren't harmful to their environment. And now today we have technology for mass communication and for mass transport. We have the ability to live in an ecologically sustainable society for everybody, but in order to do that, it is imperative that we change our cultural narrative to stop living the way that we've been living. And that doesn't mean any one solution. It means understanding that there is no one way to live. That's the problem that we have now, is that there's this one way to live, that everything is sort of been turned into and assimilated into this one particular culture ever since it started and has spread out over the course of the last 10,000 years.
And if you oppose it, where do you end up? Either dead or in jail.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about the obstacles, the resources, money, authority, arms that the system possesses, what do you need to stand up? Courage, will, determination, passion, power, and people. Lots of people.
And food.
And food.
You
yes,
have to decentralize
food.
the agriculture more before you do anything.
Yeah, and decentralization, I think, is a very important part, because our food is definitely the industrial, agricultural business, and the corporations are controlling almost every aspect of our lives these days. We depend on them for everything, and as long as we depend on them or the government, we are at their mercy. We have to start taking more of our own power and depending on each other rather than depending on them, because we can do a lot more than they can for the people. But the one thing we haven't done so far, and I'd like to ask, is define anarchy. We've mentioned the word, but we haven't given a definition yet. What is it?
I always say that anarchy is a state of having no institutional hierarchy. But to me, it's the natural state of things. Like, nature is anarchical. If you're not having this idea of there being a controlling force over all things, then it is naturally anarchy. But then we build governments on top of that, and we try to say, no, this is the way that people are supposed to function, and people will have to then conform to that system. But if they were to live naturally, they would be living in a way where each person could find their niche and work together as a group.
And produce. It's like plants don't, by their nature, plant themselves in long rows like we're planting food. But that's essentially the way they're trying to grow us. We've got these long rows of things that we have to abide by. But most plants in nature especially, they grow wherever's best for them. How they, as plants, respond to the environment around them. We're not allowed to do that because we've set up artificial means of control. Borders, for instance, and states and nations where we have no freedom of movement or no freedom to grow somewhere else where it might be better for us as individuals. And the more we grow as individuals, the more we have to share with other people. If we are stymied and don't develop, we have nothing to share, nothing to grow. But the word anarchy for me would be very simple: no rulers, and no masters. And what do we have now? That's all we live by, is rulers and masters. It doesn't care what you're dealing with. There's always this hierarchy of someone ruling, someone mastering something.
Or a group of them as a class.
Yeah, a group of them, a class. So in fact,
Yeah.
part of anarchy is, of course, class warfare.
Well,
I like that. But most people would kind of...
Anarchism is the latest version in history, or you might say like some of its variations, like anarcho-communism. But ultimately, like in the past couple hundred years, like we've gone from defining the terms of socialism and communism to having more critiques of these things, which have led us to start using other terms, which originally may have been synonymous. Before Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, the words socialism and communism were practically interchangeable depending on where you used them. Eventually, he defined terms with socialism being the in-between state where you have a state-controlled economy that would redistribute the wealth, and then that's supposed to be a step towards full communism, which is really the same thing as anarchism, which a lot of people don't see, but it is the absence of class distinction, having no poor people and no rich people, but having everybody together as a communal or non-class-based system.
Absolutely. The one problem we have today, of course, is when you say the word communism, the one thought that comes to mind has nothing to do with the real definition of the term. It comes to a political structure that was established, a political state that was established, called the Soviet Union, and of course its subordinates after that. So when you say the word communism, people really don't know what you're talking about.
No, and they probably don't know what you're talking about when you say anarchism as well. The isms are so incredibly misunderstood. I mean, most people, when you say anarchism, they're thinking about people throwing Molotov cocktails and, burning the place down, when in fact, when I listen to Albert and Phoenix talk about anarchism, I think about autonomy, I think about liberty, I think about freedom. And most of us know that to achieve those is certainly going to be a struggle, and it may require people to give up what they have. But when you have a job that's putting a roof over your head and feeding your children, you're more likely to not engage in that struggle because you fear losing what it is you have. I mean, Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And I ask, are we ready to fight to the death for autonomy, liberty, and freedom?
Now, anarchy is what happens when order is not imposed or forced. It's when we're allowed to develop as human beings and as people. Is therefore really freedom. That's the ultimate word for anarchy to me, is the freedom. Freedom to be who you are. It's the idea that people are more important than the state, or people are more important than the government. People are what's important. And that's really it. No anarchy. Hierarchy, I mean.
There are a lot of sacrifices that, like you're mentioning, that it can be hard for people to try to combat the system and pursue freedom, and that's very understandable, particularly within our society, which makes us very dependent on it, as you pointed out. However, eventually the luxury of that will be gone, and for some the luxury is already gone, and I think that's something that really people should pay attention to, because as time goes on, the ability to ignore the problems will go away, and it will get worse and worse, and more people will suffer. And the faster we collectively get together and decide to build something different, the faster that can end, and we can all go back to living a life and actually creating something that is good for ourselves.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that one. When I think of anarchy, I think of people actually developing as people, growing together, developing a society that benefits everyone. It's free of all the force and the intimidation, because all of us live in this intimidation. We all work for a living, which means you're subject to someone else for your survival. And if you don't submit to what they say, you find yourself unemployed and not able to survive very well. And so I understand that when people start asking, are you really free? The true answer is no. We have no idea of what being free really is. We're given this illusion of freedom because we can make choices, but those choices are often not true. They're not true choices. They are false.
If you were really free, you could go to another country without the need of a passport.
A border makes freedom. It's like a invisible wall. Why we draw these invisible lines, I've never really understood, or in a long time. Why do we draw these lines?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, probably to contain people and to prevent the kind of freedom that we're talking about.
When the first pictures came back from space of the Earth, there were no lines.
No, there were no lines, were there?
No, it didn't happen. People were seemingly free to move wherever you wanted to, wherever was better for you to grow and develop as a person. But, of course, now we have border guards and patrols that will shoot you if you try to do that.
That's right. And sometimes there are even lines between the states that are sort of guarded. And, you take agriculture from one state to another, you're supposed to have it inspected. And there's a great, I think it's a Woody Guthrie song about the Dust Bowl days when people from places like Georgia were trying to get out to California because that was the land of milk and honey, and they were being stopped at the border and told, go home, there's no room for you here. So yeah, those lines are kind of bizarre. I mean, the other thing that we talk about as a part of anarchy is the commons. Very important concept. And you want to talk a little bit about the commons?
You should start with this, Albert.
Yeah, well, commons is one of my things. I really believe in the commons. The commons is what the people own, the people, and we own everything. The idea that the city owns something, or the state owns something, or the federal government owns something is is definitely not true. The people own everything. So the commons, we have problems that could be solved if we recognize the fact that there is a commons. For instance, we have how many homeless people in Savannah alone?
Oh, that's
And how many empty houses do we have that no one is using?
far too many. There are a lot of houses that are empty and abandoned and that are just falling apart, and we could probably easily house a great many homeless people with them if we actually try to put them to use.
Well, I remember I walked from where I live on 37th Street over to Bull Street. And everybody's heard this before, but you're going to hear it again. And it's just a few blocks. It's probably 8 blocks or so. And in that time, I took one route there and another one back, and I counted 27 empty houses. 27 in that short distance. And that's just from 37th to Bull and 41st. So
Right.
there are enough houses probably in Savannah that are boarded up and empty that no one is using to house everyone. There's
Yep.
enough food being grown. so
Speaking-
that nobody should be hungry.
Speaking of the commons, too, I just want to point out that you mentioned about Savannah. We've got Forsyth Park, which has like lots of security cameras and stuff on there, and is meant to be relatively safe. And they kick people out of that park if they're sleeping in it at night. And I've met people who have like been told that they're not allowed to go to the park anymore because they were found sleeping there, and that makes no sense. Like, that's what the idea of the commons would say is wrong. Is this is just an open public park that you can use, and nobody can tell you that you can't sleep there. If those security cameras aren't there to keep us safe, then what are they actually for?
Plus, we're subjected to closure. There's a certain hour you are not allowed to be in the park, but it's a public park that the people own. If I own something, I get to dictate when I'm there and when I'm not there. If I don't own it and someone else owns it, then they make the rules. Well, that to me means that these parks, all the public parks, are at the whim and fancy of 9 people who rule Savannah.
They are operated for the pursuit of profit.
Yeah,
The squares
that's
are
right.
rented out for weddings. The Forsyth Park is the reason why they try to keep homeless people out of it, is to make it appeal to tourists. Like, it's all about money when it comes
That's
to how they treat people poorly.
Capital.
Yes, and I would challenge our listeners to send us a Facebook message and tell us a space within the city of Savannah, Chatham County, or any place else that actually would fit the definition of commons, that it was owned by the people, and in that space there were no rules restricting public access.
That is a very important, actually, part of the founding of Savannah. Those squares were supposed to be used by people, not rented out by a governing body for weddings.
Right.
Yeah.
But even within those squares, there are probably certain rules about what you can and cannot do.
Now?
And
Yes,
now.
there are
Yes.
now. Yes, especially on certain days of the year.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I also object to the idea, and I'm going to say this here, which is probably not the absolute best place, but
yes,
I'm
it
objected
is.
to the idea of 9 people sitting on a city council that have rulership over 140,000 people. And they say, oh, you can always talk to your representative. We don't know what's going on. What are you going to talk to them about? They do things that they don't put out. We know nothing about until after the fact. And if you oppose it, it's too late. Wham, it's already been done. Do we need half the stuff that they are spending money on? No. They're poisoning these parks with all this pesticides and fertilizers and things that are seeping into the water system. We don't get a say on that. They vote on it and have made most of the decisions even before they hit city council meeting itself. So we get the after effect. So the answer is that we don't really have a say. This representation is not really representing us. And especially when the city is still, 700 or so what do you call them, lobbyists in the
yes.
city, representing all the corporations and all the things that certainly don't represent the people. They represent the dollar, and they represent whatever they want to. And we don't have, I can't afford a lobbyist. I wish I could.
Absolutely. And what Albert just described is really a very top-down form of government. Ideally, if we had a grassroots government, it's not to say we wouldn't have representatives. We did a lot of reading about the Haudenosaunee, the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, and how the individual groups within the tribes would come together, and then they would come together as a tribe, and then they would send representatives to the Longhouse. But those representatives in the Longhouse could not make a decision without bringing the issue back down to the grassroots before they were allowed to bring a decision back. And that was grassroots democracy, which
and
we
they had to
certainly
actually
have lost.
represent whatever the people wanted, and if that didn't happen, they were in serious trouble.
Something I say commonly is that anarchism is the highest form of democracy.
Absolutely.
It's where everybody is involved with whichever decision will affect them. So you can't participate in a decision that's going to affect other people, and when they have no say in the matter, and other people can't do the same to you. But you still have an actually democratic process. But instead, we live in a society where we have people who used to be the CEO of First Chatham Bank, for example, or somebody that used to be the public spokesperson for the police right before they got on city council. Like, we have people that have clear agendas. They're trying to go for their own ends, and it's not actually for the people. They're not representing our interests. They're telling us this is our interest. Right before they ran for office, that's when the news started to report the crime problem that was not actually yet about to start in Savannah, but did start soon after by an unfortunate coincidence. Before I go on too much of a tangent, my point is that if people pay attention to local politics, they can start to learn how this system of hierarchy is disparaging so many people. 1 in every 4 people in this city is in poverty, and in some neighborhoods are over half. And they've used
the one
terms
I live in is a lot higher than most.
Yeah, and they use terms like shared economy that comes in from the tourism industry, and they're the people who have been suffering historically the most in the city are not seeing a dime from that.
No.
So that is what anarchism is trying to say, is like this system where they're allowed to divest the funds into these things that don't actually help us, and it's our work, our tax dollars, etc., is not right.
Right.
Well, the system that we have now, and especially we're talking about the shared economy, who does it really benefit? Who does tourism really benefit? Does it benefit the people in West Savannah, or on the west side, or on the south side,
Absolutely
or on
not.
the east side? Who really does that benefit? It benefits the hotel owners downtown, the restaurant owners downtown. It doesn't even really benefit the people who work downtown that are backbone of the tourist industry. They're still paid minimum wage, and I heard at a meeting not long ago that I do rail about quite often, there were 5 representatives from the tourism industry there, and they said, oh, don't worry about the low pay. That's just an entry-level pay, and everybody has the opportunity to go right to the top, and also that all the money is shared equally throughout Savannah. And we all know that is not anywhere near the case. And if you depend on tourism alone, which we no longer have industry here very much, it's either tourism or militarism, whether it's the bases or it's not even the port. Everybody comes up with the port, but Savannah depends on the military and those who support the military, and on tourism. That's not a good basis for a good economy.
No, and clearly if it was a grassroots democracy and the people got to weigh in, got to make the decisions, I think our economy would look very different. So we are going to take a pause here at this moment and identify our station, identify ourselves, and get a word from our sponsor. So you are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We're Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Brighter Day Natural Foods, offering produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. If you enjoy our programming on WRUU-LP, please support the station with a donation. As an individual, you can give any amount. become a basic station member, or become a serious fan of the station. To check out membership rates and to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Again, to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUU-LP.
And thank you for listening to Voices of Resistance. I would like to just remind you that you won't hear these kinds of discussions and conversations on corporate media. If you've been listening to Voices of Resistance the past few weeks, we actually did 2 shows on corporate media, and even public radio. Public radio is now required to go out for sponsorship, and corporate media are becoming more like corporate media. They are taking corporate sponsorship, and here we are, community radio, giving you these kinds of programming. So
plus
we're
some of the
thankful
best
to have
music
this
in
resource.
Savannah.
Yes, and we're going to introduce ourselves and get back to our conversation about anarchy. I'm Barbara Humphrey.
I'm Albert Strickland.
I'm Phoenix Godwin.
And thank you for listening. So as we're talking about anarchy, we talked a little bit earlier about the distinction between anarchism, anarchy, and anarchists. And do you want to take those?
I can do that. I'll take that.
Good, thank you.
To me, like I said at the beginning of this show, anarchy is the state of having no institutionalized hierarchy. Anarchism is the application of that into politics. It is understanding, theorizing, and philosophizing on the implications of what that means, especially considering that we've lived in a non-anachronistic society for quite a while now, and there's been a point where people started to have doubts about that and question that publicly. And this started before we actually could put words to it, as I mentioned earlier, but over time, it became very important to point this out. As Albert mentioned, communism came to be thought of particularly as like the Soviet ideology, which is very convenient for capitalist interests and also was very convenient for the Soviet Union, who was hoping that people who are interested in communism would support them with the goal of reaching full communism in mind. As we know, that's not what happened. Nobody has really reached full communism yet, but that is because of outside influences from people that have specifically tried to do everything they can to stop this from growing. Now,
I think states realize automatically that if it develops and people really understand the value in it and what freedom really is, that they'll be out of power, and that's
why a lot of wars have
agenda.
happened.
Yeah,
absolutely.
To crush anything in the name of freedom, they deny freedom.
Particularly the U.S. has worked very hard to subvert and or destroy communist movements every time that they become large. And to go back on anarchism and what it means to be an anarchist, I think that it developed a lot of traction as a response to communist ideology being sort of subverted or contorted by this Soviet ideology. And so over time people are like, okay, well, specifically anarchy, no leaders, that's what we're trying to get here. And the ideology really remains the same throughout, since before there were words for these things. But it's this idea of freedom, of having people be free from having institutionalized oppression over them, of being told what to do and how to live.
Well, what we think or what we see as definitions is usually manufactured by what we're being told, because whether it comes from school or whether it comes from advertisements or news broadcasts or writers or politicians, we grow up believing them because that's all we hear. We really don't have answers in ourselves except what they put in our head. We're not automatically born with all this knowledge. So most people who use words, anarchism, communism, socialism, any kind of ism you want, they really don't know a definition of it. They only know a perception. Communism is Soviet. Well, that's not true at all, but that's the assumption. And anarchism is chaos, which is absolutely the farthest from the truth you could get. Anarchy is the actual truest form of order, truest form of people working together. It's just amazing that they can come up with all these definitions. And one of the things I get asked often, you're an anarchist, who's going to build the roads?
The people.
Yeah,
people
because
build
who's
the
building
roads.
it now? The city doesn't build anything. The
ism
mayor's
just-
not out there doing anything. People are.
I read once that the ism just decides who gets paid.
It's
And
probably about, yeah.
It's
I like
close.
Yeah. The other thing, and this is something we discovered when we were read about anarchism. These are just a few little points that was written. Anarchists strive for a society in which everything is possible. That is a society which provides individuals with the widest possible range of choices. Anarchism is opposed to states, armies, slavery, the wages system, which is a form of slavery in my book, the landlord system, prisons, monopoly capitalism, oligopoly capitalism, state capitalism, bureaucracy, meritocracy, theocracy, revolutionary governments, patriarchy, matriarchy, monarchy, oligarchy, protection rackets, and intimidation by gangsters, and every other form of coercive institution. In other words, anarchism opposes government in all its forms.
And it may be correctly defined as opposition to government in all its forms. But it'd be a mistake, as we just said, to think of anarchism as essentially negative, as an opposition. The opposition to government arises out of a belief that society is positive, and this comes from the Anarchist Library. And I thought a real simple way to sum this up would be anarchy is what happens when order is not imposed. It's the ultimate form of freedom. Anarchism is the idea, the theory that no law or government is more important than people. And anarchists are the actors who oppose all forms of hierarchy.
I think you said that earlier, didn't you?
Yeah, well, actually, this was a point that we discussed before the show, which was it's not necessarily all forms of hierarchy. I think if we were to examine peer groups, for example, of just friends, you might notice a sort of natural hierarchy which takes place between them. Now, that may be something which you as a group of friends should examine, and maybe it is something you want to do something about, but it's not necessarily a bad thing if people have a tendency to follow someone because they think it's a good idea. The idea of an authority on a subject matter, for example, is something which can occur naturally if somebody knows about that thing. The problem is when you conflate power with authority and you make it so that power was what grants authority.
And I think we came to the conclusion that it was institutionalized hierarchy,
institutionalized
not
hierarchy.
Because you have this hierarchy of needs and hierarchy of things, and if you're a better baker than I am, I'm going to cede you that privilege to be the better baker. That's your position. And if you like to do it, if you don't, you can do something else. And in a society that's anarchistic, you're not tied to doing one thing. You can do whatever you want to do to be a part of society and fulfill that thing. Today you may do one thing, tomorrow you may do something else. You're not tied to I am this. You're free to be who you are.
I think it's very important to point out too. One of the biggest arguments against anarchism or anarchy that people have is they say that the people aren't good enough for it, or they assume that their neighbors will attack them as soon as the laws are lifted, which is sort of incongruous with what we've seen actually, not only from natural disasters and things like that have happened, but also is incongruous with our understanding of social biology. As we have reciprocal altruism, or what's called mutual aid, whereas all other social organisms which exist, we've evolved over millions of years to be social organisms and to be able to work together. That is our natural inclination. It's in our genes to be able to work together and cooperate. So anybody who tells you that we're supposed to be competitive with each other, like, they don't know what they're talking about. Ask any anthropologist, I promise you.
That's true.
Yeah.
What can I say? We look at the response that we got. These you mentioned all of these disasters, natural disasters especially. The best response comes from people and small groups. When you wait for the Red Cross to come, or you wait for the government to bring in troops, or to bring in anything, you lose. We need to start taking control of our own lives and not depending on outside sources. The problem we have now is our food supply is being controlled. We have no say in it. The grocery stores have 3 days worth of food in it. That's about it. Total.
If there's ever some sort of economic collapse, or we are just having some serious infrastructure problems and those truckers aren't getting paid to deliver food to the Kroger, and the Kroger doesn't have food in it, where are we getting the food?
Now, what are you going to do then?
We've got nothing, and that's something which America as a nation has before actually had gardens near people's homes, and has saved many, many lives before. And it is something which people really need to consider now, because this isn't. It's not a matter of saying somebody's going to viciously, try to kill everybody off by starving us. It's a matter of this is not sustainable. Something can mess up, and then people will die because we didn't look at this problem and analyze our needs.
Well, the people did not cause the Great Depression, as it's called. Right. It was not the people doing that. It was a bunch of greedy people who wanted more, and they got more. Most of them profited from it, but the people suffered. And in areas in big cities, it was more difficult. My grandmother was a sharecropper out in rural Georgia, always had gardens, always had food, could always produce food. So she said the one thing that she noticed in her day is you didn't have a lot, but you had enough. She said, now, if the same thing were to happen, there is no Kroger, no Walmart, none of this stuff, what do? You have no response. Even the hobos, they went from house to house to house as they were going on because people had food they could share. What do you have now? Nothing. So this dependence on institutions for your survival is not a good thing. All of us should have a victory garden, more or less, where we all are growing enough food that we have enough to share with everyone else for as long as we possibly can.
Yep, and if you've been listening to Voices of Resistance over the past few months, we've been talking about a lot of those institutions, rich and powerful and having amazing control over our lives, particularly the surveillance system that, is capturing data on all of us and instilling in us a sense of fear. If you take steps to change the system, there will be chaos, there will be ruin. And it makes it very difficult for any of us to really conceive an alternative to what we have now. People have been striving and dying for and achieving autonomy since they came together as a civilization. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about some of those struggles over the hundreds and hundreds of years that, people have been struggling to be autonomous in the face of powerful institutions.
Let's see. When were the Diggers a thing?
Well, there was an original group of radicals back in the 1600s, but the Diggers, as I know them, was the 1960s in I think it was San Francisco or California.
Right, they named themselves after that earlier group, and they're considered to be proto-anarchist often, and these were folks that...
And they did all the things that we're talking about in a way. They even had a theater where they could point out problems. They had free food. They had free medical care. They had everything they could possibly do so that people could learn to do themselves and share with other people so we could all survive as a people. Because believe me, Kroger and Walmart don't care whether you exist or not.
And they were all wiped out by wealthy landowners.
That's right.
They were murdered and killed because people with power can't allow that sort of society to thrive, because then everybody would be doing it.
Well, the Black Panthers is another good example. We talked about that last week or week before. Last week, I think.
Last week.
The fact that they were initially organized to protect the people from the police brutality. But then there were more problems than that. So they started working with providing food, education, providing breakfast. They once fed 20,000 children breakfast who otherwise could barely afford it before they went to school.
They would provide people with access to medical and legal needs also.
That's right.
Many things that they could do to help the community become autonomous and give them their power. That's also like one of the worst operations from our government, to shut down an organization, like a domestic organization that we know of, that ended with a lot of dead people and a lot of people in prison to this day that don't deserve it.
And what happened to them?
COINTELPRO.
Same thing that happened to the Diggers, basically. Because
the Diggers were also, exactly.
If you offer a productive and meaningful alternative to the elite control, their mission becomes to destroy you any way they can. It's the old thing, if you can't destroy the message, you destroy the messenger. Well, in this case, they tried to destroy both. Every way they could. Violence, murder, it didn't make any difference. The murder of Fred Hampton, the imprisonment of George Jackson, and all. It's just amazing what they did to these groups who were trying to actually make a difference in people's lives.
Well, there are still political prisoners to this day.
Oh, we have so many political prisoners, you wouldn't believe how many we have.
Absolutely. And, the seeds of anarchism go back to ancient China. They go back to original societies,
people,
human beings who lived together for thousands of years in a self-governing way without a ruling or political class. We see reference to anarchism without using the specific word in ancient Greek literature, in the Middle East. So it's not something that has just sprung up in modern times, but has been a way of organizing, of people organizing themselves for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And I'm going to ask Albert to talk a little bit about the Luddites, because it's one of his favorite groups.
Yeah, I'm what they basically call an anarcho-primitivist. I know, Phoenix laughs. But it's an idea that we're too tied to industrial technology. And the Luddites were a group in England that recognized that fact just before and during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They saw what was coming, and they attempted to stop it any way they could. In fact, they sabotaged a lot of the machinery and things because these machines were taking jobs away from people who needed them to survive. And that was a big thing, especially in England in that time period, not have a job or a means of supporting yourself. And the same thing is being true now. You look at how many jobs we're losing, and the more that people are demanding benefits and demanding a decent wage, you're going to find that more jobs are going to disappear. There are more robots now. There'll be more drones. There'll be more of everything. I had a friend who was a cashier at Kroger, and I told him, you better watch out because they have these
Self-checkout.
I never use a self-checkout. That to me is a job lost to a lot of
scab
people.
Machines.
Scabs. So here it is. I tell him, we meet at the Bean one day, and I tell him, you better watch out. They're already there. And they had 3 fast checkouts over against the wall. And then they had about 5 or 6 of the regular cashiers. Sure enough, he comes in one day and say, I just lost my job. They put in 3 machines over there, and they didn't need me anymore.
It's really sad, though, when you live in a society where having robots that can do all of our jobs for us is a bad thing. that shouldn't be the way that it is.
It shouldn't be.
That's why I think that the problem isn't necessarily it's not the use of technology, it's the manner in which industry is formed, the way that it is in an
I think it's who
unsustainable
controls it.
way.
Who's controlling this technology and for what end? It's not for the people or for the jobs. It's for the rich who are
It's for
benefiting
profit.
from
It's
it.
all
We're
for
not.
profit.
Yeah. So I would prefer at least the option to have the ability to stand up for myself, but I can't fight a machine when the rich man puts it there, and I can't unless I can sabotage it. So
Well, see, then
the Luddites did, but they also were.
so that was a labor movement primarily?
Yes, labor. It's a labor movement. Yes.
Now, today, when it comes to what people can do about the situation, I mean, we've talked about a lot of things today that are really that everybody's aware of regularly. Like, we know that these problems are going on, and most people choose not to face them each and every day because that would drive you insane. But on the other hand, it's not going away. The problems are getting worse, and as I said before, you will have to reckon with them eventually. So one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that it's not a matter of harm reduction. Like, you're not going to recycle your way out of this. You're not going to take shorter showers your way out of this.
Come on, man. The point is, we're being blamed for a lot of things. This climate change. I change my light bulb, and I can change the world. The only thing I like about it is the showering part when they said, save water, shower with a friend. I like that one, see, that was cool. But the rest of it, why am I to blame? I'm to blame for having a light bulb that takes more energy when you go downtown in Savannah to the tourist sections and the lights on just the churches and the government buildings. I could use my light bulb probably for 10,000 years and not use what they use in a day. So if you're going to really be serious about it, let's make some real choices and some real changes. And that's actually what anarchy is advocating. Let's make some real changes.
It's not meant to be a reaction. It is meant to be a constructive idea, one where if anybody gets involved, then they can contribute to that idea. There is a group that I'm involved with called Savannah Comrades, but this idea that I'm going to mention actually goes back to even when I was involved with Occupy. A lot of times doing activism, I've experienced a lot of people giving criticism to these activist movements from outside of it, and they go, oh, I kind of like you guys, except you don't do this. Or like, oh, I generally agree with some of your ideas, but I think that you should do this. And that drives me nuts because the whole point is to show up and help direct it. We're supposed to be in this together and building this thing together. And if you have an idea of how you think it should go, come over. If you have an idea of how it should go and you don't think it's worth coming over, then why is anybody going to if you're not going to be invested with your community, should your community care what you think? Other than the fact that, today where we're not in a society where we're dependent on each other, we have to be dependent on the people that are willing to cooperate.
True. I remember people coming up at Occupy and saying, yes, you're not doing this, or you have no clear goal. Well, we did have a clear goal, and they were stated in the declaration that was done within days of the initial occupation in New York. And everybody got the impression, because that's what they were being told, again, through the media. So what we think and what we know are usually controlled by us. That's why this independent media, really independent local media, is so important to us. We need a lot more of it. The controlled press. We've had shows. If you've listened to Voices of Resistance over the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've covered most of these issues one way or another, whether it was the press or whether it was militarism or whatever it is. And we're victims. And they say, but you can vote your way out of this. You can vote them in, out. Well, how did they get there in the first place? We voted them in. So we vote them out. So we vote other people in. It's just this constant back and forth, in and out. Everybody's making money but us. They're victims. And we have the right to do this and the right to that. I looked up today the NDAA 2017 version of it. You know how many pages it is? 1,549 or so pages.
Which is that, the NDAA?
The NDAA.
No,
National Defense Authorization Act. And what it is, it's a off-budget act that provides money to the military. So you have your budget and the military gets a certain amount of money. But then mid-year, you have this NDAA, which gives a huge amount of money to the military. But then there's all these add-ons. And the last NDAA, the 2017 version, had an add-on to create an Office of Propaganda. So... And we read about one.
I thought we had that already.
I know. Well, we did. It just wasn't formalized.
Now they're going to pay more for it.
We were reading about one particular congressman today from Tennessee, from
Steve
Memphis,
Cohen.
Tennessee, Steve Cohen, who was standing up like a hero because he's ready to introduce impeachment charges against Trump. And we were kind of curious. He's talking about American values. And we thought, well, I wonder how he voted on certain things. And sure enough, he voted for the 2017 NDAA with its Office of Propaganda, with gobs of money for the military to put troops on the ground in Syria, keep them in Iraq, keep them in Afghanistan, keep those drones flying and dropping bombs. So we were kind of thinking, those are great American values, Steve. Thank you very much. And... the systems that are in place are just beyond.
We have this system that says we have rights, and they're guaranteed on this piece of paper. There are 10 of them, I think it is, right? And the government is supposed to protect those rights at all cost. Well, the idea is that it comes from them. They're protecting us, but they're inalienable rights, but they're only guaranteed by the government, which makes no sense, because if the government controls them, the government can do exactly that.
If they were inalienable, how did we not have them to begin with?
Right, they treated them as privileges.
How can they take
They'd
them
only
from
do that
us?
on paper so that they can take it away.
That's right. That's right.
And they do a very good job of that, because we have the highest incarceration rate of any nation or combination of nations in the world.
Oh, and Savannah's a great place to talk about that.
It is really.
So in the 5 minutes that we have left, we've talked a lot about anarchism, that theory, those sets of ideas. But I know, Albert, you in particular, you use the word praxis a lot. So I'd like to hear you both talk a little bit about how you take this theory and put it into practice, how you create action from theory.
We've talked about it a little bit already, the praxis part of it. Phoenix and I were discussing this earlier, and we came up, theory's important. I'm more the praxis part. But I don't really care for the theoretical part on paper or from voices as much as I want to see the practice part. When you've got a shovel and you're working and building a community garden and working your own, that to me is anarchism. When you write a paper on the importance of doing your own garden, it's not quite the same for me. So I want to see you show up with a shovel, or I want to show up with a shovel. That's good. Let's work. That's praxis. The practice of anarchy is more important than just the theory. Now, Phoenix did make a very valid point, which I will let Kim make, about theory being important in the role it plays.
I'm not sure if I could say verbatim what I said before, but I can at least say, like, that's why we're here right now. I mean, we're telling people about these ideas because ultimately nobody really practices these few people practice these ideas relatively without having heard about it and understanding it. And a lot of people understand that something's wrong and they want to do something about it, but they haven't really taken the time to understand the situation or the fundamental problems we have. So learning about the history of people who have really analyzed this to death and like understanding where they're coming from so you don't have to spend all that time doing that can be very helpful. There is definitely a time where you got to put the book down and go outside and start growing some food, or start helping to stop waste or fight gentrification, things like that.
Yeah.
But
gentrification is a big issue. Don't depend on the police for everything.
But if people don't, gentrification is a complicated subject, though. Yeah. If you're not educating people on gentrification, they will possibly make it worse. And that's the same with a lot of these things. Like, people have to be educated or they could make it worse.
So we need to do a show on gentrification.
Yes, we do. And are there other actions that people are taking to stand up to the system, and particularly with the ultimate goal of taking the system down, of building something to replace it, if we all agree that reforming, just fixing what's broken, is not the answer?
I don't think that there's one that's strong enough right now to... Not that specifically going towards that goal. I think most of the strongest ones we have are sort of reactions, like, for example, Lazad and other places that are occupations to defend particularly ecological causes. Those often have very strong followings, but I think that what we will need is a group of people gathering from all over the world to build a better concept, a better society together that follows within this ideology, to set an example and do it in such a way that is inspirational to people and can spread as an idea. So even if it were to get repressed and destroyed by imperialist causes or capitalist interest, it would still manage to keep going as an idea, and like people could start building it. But you can't go to a commune where nobody can see you and do it, otherwise nobody will learn. It has to be something that's visible, and you have to like start building the new way as opposed to relying on the old systems.
And we need to do this together, working together. That's why the community spirit is so important, because anarchy without community is nothing. I mean, you've got to have, that's the whole basis for anarchy, is community, people working together, not only for the common property, because private property is not a solution. If you think you own your own property right now, it's your private property, you're wrong. You don't own anything, whether it's your car or whether it's your house or anything. You do not own it. The state does. And if you try and don't pay your taxes for 1 year because it's your property and see what happens, you will lose it. I don't care if it's paid off. It doesn't matter. The taxes are still there. So you always owe. You're always in slavery or in debt to that state that owns the things.
And certainly, as we know, some of us who've been involved in struggles, or, read our history and learn our history, as soon as your community, your opposition to the state as it is right now, becomes bigger and more visible and has a chance of success, you're going to meet incredible opposition. And there may come a time.
If I might on that opposition, because I've got to say one point that I thought of lately when I was in Standing Rock. All right? Here we are. We've got this hill up there. What's on that hill? National Guard, Homeland Security, and all the county police from states all around. And who were they standing against? The people, unarmed. And they did a very good job.
And this is a perfect time to talk to you about a documentary called The F Word Point. When do you get to that point when you say enough is enough? Sunday, 5:30, Tribe House, 631 West 37th Street. We will be showing that documentary and hopefully a great discussion to follow. Bring a dish to share and come and, the F word point, the point of no return.
You're listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah.